There is no paradise more wondrous for any soul than to be exposed to God's manifestation in His day, to hear His verses and believe in them, to attain His presence, which is not but the presence of God, to sail upon the sea of the heavenly kingdom of His good pleasure, and to partake of the choice fruits of the paradise of His divine oneness. The Bob.
Thank you. So our speaker today is Mr. Tom Lysaght, and his topic is Love's Companion, the Martyrdom of the Bob. Raised Irish Catholic in Brooklyn, storyteller and Harvard graduate Tom Lysaght has written some 30 plays in both English and Spanish. His off-Broadway play, Nobody Don't Like Yogi, starring Emmy Award-winning actor Ben Gazzara as Yogi Berra, toured nationally. His play, Heralds of the Covenant, was performed on the main stage of the 1992 World Congress in New York City. A member of the Dramatists Guild, Lysaght was founding director and resident playwright of El Teatro de Pan y Paz, Bread and Peace Theater, while also serving as manager of Radio Bahá'í of Lake Titicaca during his 3 years pioneering in the Andes of Peru. He also made 3 trips to rural India on behalf of OSED to assist with village puppet theater. Lysaght has received numerous writing fellowships, including from the MacDowell Colony, the Edward Albee Foundation, and the Israeli Center for the Arts. His prose has been published by Samuel French, One Voice Press, George Ronald, and Calumet Press. His historical nonfiction novel, Persian Passion, published in 2019, and his generational memoir, Old Wives' Tales, published in 2022, are both available on Amazon. A chapter from his coming-of-age memoir, Till Your Father Gets Home, can be read on his website, Social/Sacred Space, which serves primarily as a resource for utilizing theater in grassroots community building. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Mr. Lysaght.
Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. I'll start off with a story to give a little background as to why we're all here. Imagine if all the mirrors of the world, the hand mirrors, the full-length mirrors, the vanity mirrors, the rear view mirrors, wall mirrors, shaving mirrors, dresser mirrors, if they all clustered together according to their physical characteristics, according to their shape, their size, their color, their monetary value, and they forgot to reflect. And yet their purpose, all mirrors' purpose, is to reflect. Wouldn't that be unfortunate? Now, suppose their purpose was actually to reflect the light. Then the whole world would go dark as they turn in upon themselves, clustering according to their physical characteristics and forgetting to reflect that light. The world would go dark. Well, essentially, this is what human beings have done historically. Going back to the Bible and the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, Genesis, we're told that we were made in the image and likeness of God. And my understanding of that is that we're made in the image of the attributes and the qualities of the divinity. So essentially, then, we don't have a soul. We are a soul. We have a body. And yet, historically, what human beings have done is they've clustered and identified themselves by their material and biological characteristics, by class, nationality, color, gender, culture. And so we really haven't wanted to reflect the image and likeness of God. We've been reflecting our material and biological characteristics instead. Well, the truth is that actually we haven't had the capacity and the potential to exist in the image and likeness of God. Because how could we without contact with each other across the world? Because until the 19th century, there was no mass communication or mass transportation. And so this oneness that the Godhead exemplifies, we really could not reflect until the age of fulfillment came about in the year 1844. We've always had divine educators who have come to guide us. From Abraham to Moses to Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, Zoroaster, Baha'u'llah is the latest. And yet he's the first in the age of fulfillment to fulfill this age of prophecies that all the other divine educators had come to educate us according to. And so previous to 1844, we really did live in an us and them society because we separated according to our physical and biological characteristics, nationality, color, et cetera, gender, as I mentioned before. So essentially, we were a culture of contest, an us and them culture. But this age of fulfillment that began almost 200 years ago began the age of cooperation. Now, what's the proof of this? Science is the proof of it, because if you look at a graph of inventions since 1844, we see that all our mass communication and mass transportation, all the technology we're enjoying right now on the Zoom meeting really has come about since this dawn of this new age. So science and its advances proves our capacity to also socially and spiritually unite and advance. In a sense, then, you can say that Baha'is don't believe in anything. They recognize truths. So we recognize the equality of men and women. We recognize the harmony of science and religion because of this conscious knowledge, as opposed to blind faith, that Baha'u'llah, as this latest divine messenger, has enabled us to perceive. In fact, the first Baha'i principle is the independent investigation of truth. That scientific method must be applied to spiritual principles. So that's what I mean when I say we don't believe, we recognize, because one can believe erroneously. The reality today is that the earth is one country and mankind its citizens. We are one. We are made in the image and likeness of God, that one Godhead, so to speak, that one great source, that one first cause. So in that sense, how are we one? We're one in that every one of us in this meeting and in the whole world has the same vocation. We're all called to reflect the attributes of God: generosity, justice, trustworthiness, kindness, chastity. And so our diversity pertains to our careers and our jobs, and to our colors and our nationality and our genders. But we are one in terms of the vocation that we have of reflecting the attributes of God. And so we have to obey our calling to reflect this light. And so if we recognize the manifestation, which is the word Baha'is use for these divine educators, if we recognize the manifestation of God for the age in which we live, then we'll be able to reflect this light. Now, as most of you know, the darkest hour is just before dawn. And so as you sit there wondering, how is the world one right now when it's so divided? Well, the fact of the matter is that this is the darkest hour. That's why we see so much identity politics today. We see this last gasp of clustering according to biological and material similarities, as opposed to clustering according to our one human vocation. And so that's why the world is going dark right now. Baha'is are being called, we all are being called, and Baha'is are trying to reflect this light of oneness, to reflect what Jesus prophesied as the coming of heaven on earth. And we will have this heaven on earth if we reflect these attributes and fulfill our calling, our vocation, as having been made in the image and likeness of God. So there are no chosen people. We're all called to do this, and we're having this meeting to remind us to do that. And the thing to, I think, really help us have hope in this day is that if we even go back again to the Bible, let's say to the book of Isaiah, we know that we're told that the law of God will flow out from Zion, from the Holy Land, from, metaphorically speaking, from the divine educators. And so it's not simply a matter of individuals reflecting this light and this justice, but its governance will reflect this, that the law of God will flow out from Zion. So this is my introduction, this story, but don't take my word for any of this, because according to the Baha'i principles, we have to have our independent investigation of truth. And so it falls upon each one of us to investigate for ourselves and have scientific method as our means to recognizing if Baha'u'llah is indeed this latest divine educator who's come to initiate this age of fulfillment. So today's topic was advertised as Love's Companion, the Martyrdom of the Bab. And so I want to tell you a story about this obedience to the calling to reflect the attributes and qualities of the divinity. In 1848, there was a young man, actually he was a boy, he was 17. And he's known to history as Anis, but his name was Mirza Muhammad Ali. And he was only 17 years old in 1848 when he came upon the writings of Baha'u'llah's herald, who was known as the Bab, which means the gate. He immediately recognized that this was a source of divine guidance. And so in July of 1848, at the same time, incidentally, in Seneca Falls, New York, one of the first women's conferences was convening to reflect this new day in terms of the equality of men and women. In July of 1848, the Bab was brought into a city in Iran, in Persia, for an inquisition by the priesthood, who were very uncomfortable with losing their prominence and preeminence. And so they were threatened by the popularity of this new divine educator. He was to be interrogated by the chief priest in the presence of the crown prince, another 17-year-old, who would later become Nasruddin Shah. But right now, in 1848, he was the crown prince. All the residents of the city of Tabriz were forbidden to approach the prisoner when he entered the city. In fact, town criers were sent throughout the town saying if anyone approached him, they would be stripped of their property and all their possessions. Whoever makes an attempt to approach the Sayyid Bab shall have all his possessions and property seized and be condemned to life imprisonment. Such was the cry of the town criers as they went through the city. It's quite a threat. The prophet was coming to Tabriz, the new divine educator, and this boy, Anis, longed to meet his Lord because he had recognized him through his writings. However, Anis's father was terrified of the consequences, the legal consequences, life imprisonment, losing all your possessions and property. And so he locked his son up in the house. And so for the days that the Bab was in Tabriz, poor Anis was a prisoner in his own house. Finally, the Bab was returned to prison in the outlying districts. And his father thought, okay, now it would be safe to allow my son to leave the house. But as soon as he opened the door to his room, Anis made plans to visit the Bab in this distant prison of Sharik. The father again had to lock him up. And then one day, the boy was suddenly calm. The father was concerned his son had lost his mind. So he asked another well-known Babi believer, who was a relative, to talk to Anis. And the young boy told this uncle that he had met the Bab in a dream. You think I'm out of my mind, he said to his uncle. Well, I am. I'm in my heart now. You know, my father locked me in the house to keep me from the Bab, and I was in despair, so miserable, so agitated that one night, unable to sleep, I wept until dawn. In desperation, I turned my face to the prison of Sharik and begged the Bab for relief. Suddenly, I heard his voice. Rejoice, said the voice of the Bab. The hour is approaching when in this very city, I shall be suspended before the eyes of the multitude and shall fall a victim to the fire of the enemy. I shall choose no one except you to share with me the cup of martyrdom. Rest assured that this promise which I give you shall be fulfilled. Anis was now not only calm, but content. He agreed to keep his vision a secret, telling only his uncle at this point, and to keep the Bob's promise of martyrdom locked within his own heart. All his desire to leave Tabriz vanished. He was content to await the fulfillment of this visitation he had had, this promise from the Bab. And he vowed to be obedient to his father and to show him respect in all matters until that promise would be fulfilled. So for the next 2 years, Mirza Muhammad was true to his promise. He proved to be a devoted son. His father at last relaxed, and though still a teenager, he married and also became a devoted husband, and then a young father. As 2 years passed in this idyllic manner, and then came the summer of 1850, 2 years after the Bab's previous visitation to the city of Tabriz. And the Bab was now to be executed in the city of Tabriz. He was stripped of his green turban, which signified that he was a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and then paraded through the streets. A tremendous commotion erupted because so many people had recognized him as this divine educator. And then, of course, there were many people who just were sort of fascinated by the dramatic events of current events, as we see today happens to people. They get so distracted by simple news. And the crowds throng the streets, line the rooftops, straining to get a glimpse of this merchant prophet, because his profession had been as a businessman. Never before had the city experienced such turmoil. And as the Bab approached the courtyard of the barracks where he was to be imprisoned and then executed, the young man, who now is around 20 years of age, forced his way through the crowd. Ignoring the armed guards, Anis ignored the danger and leapt forward and threw himself at the feet of the Bab. Clinging to the hem of his garment, he said, "Send me not from me, O master. Wherever thou goest, suffer me to follow thee." "Muhammad Ali, arise," said the Bab. "Rest assured that you will be with me. Tomorrow you shall witness what God hath decreed." Anis was immediately seized and thrown into a separate cell in the prison. But when he wept and begged to be placed in the same cell with the Bab, his wish was granted. That night, the Bab's face glowed with joy. His mission, he knew, was now near its fulfillment and completion. Indifferent to the storm raging around him, he cheerfully conversed with his three fellow prisoners who were followers, one of whom, of course, was Mirza Muhammad, Anis. They shared the cell with him. And then he made an unusual request, the Bab, a request that would cause Mirza Muhammad to be remembered for all time. "Tomorrow," said the Bab to his 4 companions, "tomorrow will be the day of my martyrdom. Would that one of you, my devoted followers, might now arise and with his own hands end my life. I prefer to be slain by the hand of a friend rather than by that of an enemy." The other disciples shrank back at the thought of killing the manifestation of God, the divine educator. But Anis sprang to his feet. "I am ready to obey instantly," he said, "with exact obedience, whatever my Lord might ask of me." It was shocking enough to see him willing to murder the manifestation of God, even if it had been the Bab's own request. But what was equally surprising was his willingness to abandon his most cherished wish. For if Anis strangled the Bab now, as he was ready to do, how could he be martyred with him on the morrow, the fulfillment of the promise he had been waiting 2 years to experience? The Bab then intervened and compelled Anis to abandon his thought of killing him. But what to the other Babis, his fellow disciples, was blasphemy, to the Bab was obedience. This youth, he said, who hath arisen to comply with my wish, will together with me suffer martyrdom. Him will I choose to share with me its crown. Suddenly, it became clear why Anise had been promised this unique privilege. The Bab had foreseen his example of unhesitating obedience. And now we come back to that theme that I introduced with my story about the mirrors, that all of us are called to obey our common calling, to reflect the attributes of God. But in order to know what those qualities of God are, we have to recognize the divine educator for the age in which we live, and then obey whatsoever he instructeth us to do. This station of instant exact obedience had won for Anise this honor of being with the Bab through all eternity by virtue of being martyred with him. And so that night, the Bab bestowed a new name upon Mirza Muhammad, the one we know him by, the one that history will forever know him by. He was named Anise, which means companion. Because obedience and love that comes, that causes that obedience, love for the divine educator, was his companion, is the companion. For his unflinching obedience, Anise was now to be the Bab's companion for all eternity, through all the worlds of God. So when we look at the shrine of the Bab today, we often forget that Anise is buried there with the Blessed Bab. Anyway, the next day in this summer of 1850, on July 9th, and so we celebrate, or I should say, we observe the anniversary of this martyrdom in the next day and two. The next day, Anise begged the commander of the firing squad to position him in such a way that his own body might shield that of the Bab from the bullets, the 750 rifles of the firing squad. He was eventually suspended in such a way that his head rested on the breast of his Lord. And the firing squad of 3 rows of 250 riflemen took aim. And you know the rest of this story with all its drama, and the disappearance of the Bab and then his return. But I think what gets lost sometimes in the drama of the Bab's disappearance, and I encourage you to read this historical story for yourself, a story that has been historically recounted not only by the local Persians and the scholars present from Persia, but many Western scholars who were on hand, either firsthand or secondhand, and have recounted this historical event. I think what gets lost sometimes, though, when we read about this incredible drama, in many ways akin to the drama of the Christ's crucifixion, we sometimes forget the essence of this story. Certainly, of course, the essence essentially is what, once again, the manifestation of God is put to death by the priesthood of the previous religion in fear of losing their power. But it's also the story of obedience, the act of instant and exact obedience to the manifestation of God, even when a disciple was asked to murder the manifestation of God. This is one of those stories, it's like a Zen koan. You know, we have to meditate on the story of the patriarch Abraham's intended sacrifice of his son on the mountain in obedience to the order of the divine essence, the unknown, the unknowable essence, the Godhead. It's not something we can logically understand, killing one's own child in obedience to God. And so it's something we have to meditate on, just as this story requires our meditation. Or meditating on how Tahereh, the great Bahá'í woman, poet, and scholar, her abandonment of her children in order to obey and follow the promptings of this new day. These stories are for us to meditate on, to come to an understanding in our own hearts. But to give some perspective to this event, the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi has called the dust of the Bab the center of planet Earth. Abdul Baha has said that so precious is the Bab's dust, and remember now, Anis's dust is mingled with it, that the very earth surrounding the shrine of the Bab that houses this dust is blessed, the very earth surrounding it. Abdul Baha goes on to say that that spot is the spot round which the conquest on high, all the ascended holy souls and saints, they circle in adoration. Because obedience is the essence of the demonstration of one's recognition of the truth. Obedience is the Bab's companion for all eternity. So this Baha'i Holy Day, this observance of the martyrdom of the Bab, is a day for me to meditate on obedience in my own life. You know, obedience is not a very popular word in these individualistic days in which sometimes the self is upheld as the only authority to be obeyed, whatever the promptings of the self and even the lower self. So the self has become a false god in many ways, a false authority. And yet all love poetry and love lyrics and the songs we listen to, we hear lyrics such as a person saying, I'd climb any mountain for you, I'd even do wrong for you, I'd follow you anywhere. So all our poetry and love lyrics reflect this innate human desire to submit to an outside authority. Unfortunately, many of us do it to another human being erroneously. And so the shambles of modern married life reveal that many people have submitted to a fellow human being. In fact, some religions in the vow of marriage even say that you will submit to the will of your husband in many ways. And so we know that the only infallible authority is the source of divine guidance that comes from these divine educators. So once again, the importance of recognizing the divine educator for the age in which we live. In fact, Baha'u'llah tells us in the very first paragraph of his book of laws, the Kitab-i Aqdas, that to recognize, once again, not to believe, but to use scientific method and to recognize the manifestation of God for the age in which we live must be accompanied by obedience to the teachings. You know, it would be like if those of you who are parents, if you were moved to a new town, you'd want to know, well, who's the best doctor in this town in case, God forbid, my child should get sick. So you look for the best pediatrician and you do a great investigation of who this might be. And then when you found it, you'd be very content that you had come to recognize who the best pediatrician is. So let's say the unfortunate event comes about where your child gets very sick. So now you go to this physician because you've recognized this is the best physician. You haven't believed it, you've recognized it. And now the physician says, okay, here's the medicine. Your child will get better, but this medicine is going to taste terrible. It's going to upset her stomach and it'll keep her up all night and she may cry, but it will cure her. Now, if at that point you said, no, thanks anyway, but I don't want to make my child uncomfortable, I'm not going to obey this prescription. How foolish would that be? So once one has recognized who the divine educator, who the divine physician is for the age in which we live, we have to turn to whatever that prescription for living is, even if it makes us a little uncomfortable, because we know it's what will heal not only us, but it's going to heal the illnesses we see all around us in humanity today. And so I'd like to conclude with a passage from something the Bab says about this momentous day in honor of this holy day, observing his martyrdom. Give ear, O my servant, to that which is being sent down unto thee from the throne of thy Lord. He hath called into being his creatures, that they may know him. Unto the cities of all nations he hath sent his messengers, whom he has commissioned to announce unto men tidings of the paradise of his good pleasure. ages rolled away until they attain their consummation in this, the Lord of all days, the day in which the beauty of the all-glorious shone forth in the exalted person of the Bob. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that really inspiring, uplifting story with us. If anyone has any questions, you can put it in the chat. The question is, could you explain the circumstances of the martyrdom of the Bob and how that happened? A very long question, I guess, but
And I bet the questioner knows the answer. But it is a great story. Unfortunate as it is. So we know that when the Bob was brought out into that courtyard and Anais begged to have his head resting on the breast of the Bob as they were tied to the wall of the barracks. In 1850, the smoke from 750 muskets was quite immense. And when the smoke cleared after the rifles were fired, the muskets, and once again, the roofs were crowded with people, the courtyard was jammed with people. Anais was standing against the wall, completely unhurt, and the Bob was gone, had disappeared. And as I say, once again, this has been historically documented. And of course, the crowd was yelling, "It's a miracle, it's a miracle." And of course, now the government authorities who were obeying the behests really of the chief priests went madly in search of the Bob, and they found him back in his cell. Now, when the Bob had been led from his cell, he had been in the process of dictating his final instructions to his three disciples that were with him. And when the guards came in to roughly pull him away, he said, "Not until I have finished my work here dictating can you take me away." And they're like, "Oh yeah, right." They just dragged him off. Okay. So when he disappeared and they went looking for him, they found him back in the cell finishing his dictation. And he turned to the guard and he said, "Okay, now I'm ready to go." And so they drag him back out, to the courtyard. The 750 riflemen, a special Christian brigade had been chosen to execute the Bob because a Muslim prophecy has said that Muslims would kill the promised one when he appears. So now this 750 Christian regiment, they refused to shoot again. And so now 750 Muslim riflemen have to be assembled, and they proceed to execute the Bob and Anais. And when the smoke clears the second time, their bodies are reduced, to a mass of pulp, except the face of the Bob was completely untouched. And this so amazed the local governor that he actually had the court painter do a portrait of the Bob's face that had not been at all hurt. And there was this incredible earthquake that happened, very similar to the earthquake that occurred when Jesus Christ passed away on the cross. In fact, there's so many similarities between not only the young life of both the Bob and Jesus Christ, but the brevity of their dispensation and the circumstances of their dramatic martyrdom. So I think that's the story of the person one.
thank you. What is the source of what you had read at the end of your talk?
There's a wonderful book called Days of Remembrance, which is a collection of all Baha'u'llah's writings about all the Baha'i holy days. And under the section of the Martyrdom of the Bab, that was actually the first paragraph of the first tablet in here. And that's available online for free if you go to Baha'i Book Source, if you don't have the hard copy.
What do we know of the wife and child of Anais after his martyrdom?
Not much. In fact, I wrote a play about this called Love's Companion many years ago that was performed. And I dramatized in that play, and that's on the website that that was mentioned at the beginning, if one cares to read that play. The chief priest actually brought his little boy and his wife to Anais to try to convince him to deny his faith in order to save his life. And there's this pathetic scene of the little boy, toddler, 2 years old, begging his father. And once again, this is one of those stories, like Abraham's intended sacrifice of his son, that we have to meditate on, because we can't logically understand how a parent could endure that kind of a plea from a toddler and yet still go to one's death. So as I say, these are like Zen koans that we have to spend our life meditating on. What is the nature of obedience that some seemingly almost unfathomable deeds have been done? And as I mentioned, we often talk about Tahara removing the veil, but we often skip over the fact that she had to abandon all her children in order to follow the Bab. Did I answer the question? I forget what the question was.
Just about the wife.
About his wife. Other than that, I don't know too much else about what occurred after that, But that uncle, whose name was Hassani Zanussi, is a very famous Babi who was one of the first to recognize Baha'u'llah as the manifestation of God. In 1851, when Baha'u'llah was temporarily exiled to Iraq, not when he was exiled in 1852, but in 1851, this uncle actually recognized that Baha'u'llah was the manifestation of God even before he had announced he was. And he's worth investigating as well, that uncle. So maybe following the trail of whatever that is written about that uncle might give us some information about Anis's family, but I don't think so.
Thank you for the wonderful, less known story of Anais. The distinction between recognition versus blind belief would seem to be important for many aspects of our lives. Can you expound on your thoughts regarding the criteria for recognition?
I think it's a good opportunity for us to once and for all stop saying Baha'is believe, because who cares what we believe? Baha'is recognize the equality of men and women. Baha'is recognize the harmony of religion and science, because we have to show that we apply scientific method. So I can have a gold ring and believe it's a gold ring because it was given to me. But if I don't understand the quality of gold, it might be fool's gold, or it might even be bronze, and I just think it's gold. I believe it's gold. See, most people's religion, excuse me, is an accident of birth. But in this day, Baha'u'llah forbids, once again, he forbids clustering according to biology or materiality. And so one cannot be born into the Baha'i faith simply because of heredity. One has to investigate the faith for him or herself, even if born into a Baha'i family, because mere belief is insufficient. So I can believe this ring is gold and be wrong. My knowledge is very incomplete. Such would be the knowledge of a child born into a Baha'i family who merely believes because his parents believe, instead of doing the personal quest to recognize Baha'u'llah. And so if I come to understand the qualities of gold, the qualities of what it means to be a divine educator, a manifestation of God, that I'm going to recognize gold in whatever manner it appears. In fact, Baha'u'llah's first major book, the Book of Certitude, was written on this theme. He's asked by someone, how can one recognize the Bab as a divine educator? And he begins the first 100 pages of the book talking about previous messengers of God, going back to Abraham and Adam and Noah. And he says, showing that if one could recognize them, then one would be able to recognize the Bob. And that's why so many people don't recognize the new divine educator when they grow up in a religion merely being a believer, because they believe in this person or personality or even the persona, and yet they're unable to see that these qualities have appeared again. And so that's the importance that Abdu'l-Baha always stressed about using scientific method. And he emphasizes the inadequacy of using tradition, of using the mere senses, of and a number of things. He points out that these are not enough to recognize. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Could you please put your website in the chat? Some people are asking if you could do that.
Yeah, it's easy to remember. It's called yourcreativestage.com, all small case, yourcreativestage.com.
Great. Put that in there.
And it's on, if I'm not mistaken, it's on that brief blurb on the flyer for today.
Yeah. Is Anis buried with the Bob?
Yeah, because as I say, the 750 bullets blended the flesh of the two of them. So he is, yes. So once again, just to reiterate, to show that the station of obedience, which is not a popular word in this day and age, and yet we obey all the time. We obey traffic lights. We obey the curriculum of the university, believing it's going to lead us to a degree if we obey this curriculum. We see the power of obedience. And yet in this day and age in which the self has seemed to become a false idol, we don't put obedience, we don't talk about that word too much anymore. But of course, we're talking about obedience to the one and only infallible source of guidance, which is the manifestation of God for the age in which we live. And that's why our purpose in life, from the moment we're born, is to recognize who is the divine educator for today, because otherwise we don't know what's good for us. We don't know what the prescription for living is, who that divine physician is. And that story I told you about the mother going to the pediatrician, we want to know. We don't always like the medicine, but nonetheless, we know it's what's going to make not only us well, but the entire world.
Thank you. I think that's all of our questions. So thank you, Mr. Lysaght, so much.
My pleasure.
Our speaker next week will be Dr. Vahid Ranjbar, and his topic is materialism and the fall of religion. So these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I put the link to our YouTube channel and our mailing list in the chat. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.